In addition to the game, a series of prequel comics began releasing 3 months ahead of the game and wrapped up 5 years later. They begin with events surrounding the prologue and continue on until just before the events of the game. After the main series concluded, production began on Injustice Ground Zero, which retells the events of the game from Harley Quinn's perspective and leads into the events of the sequel. I don't want to get too into the comics, but I think they're worth discussing here since they're a major part of the game's universe and could have a huge impact on the sequel. It's evident from the start that the team behind the comic series didn't expect it to go on nearly as long as it did. It must have been a huge success, leading to what should have been maybe 6 volumes becoming double that. You see hints of Barry and Billy's problems with Superman's methods very early on, but it's barely touched upon. It's only really brought up after year 1, right near the end, so they can gain conviction in following the Despot to get them back to the place they're supposed to be at the start of the game. With how long the comic eventually went on for, it's basically eclipsed the game as the primary Injustice story, which is a shame because there were a lot of things you knew wouldn't go anywhere since they weren't brought up in the game. And when the appearance of the Green Lantern Corps or the Greek gods don't go anywhere, there's really no point in this thing existing. As I explained in the episode of A Line Through Time on prequels, the comics exist primarily to answer the question, where is X? For example, if the top Green Lantern of Earth has defected to the Yellows, where are the other Earth-based Green Lanterns? If Superman murdered Green Arrow, where is Oliver's wife, the Black Canary? Where is the Martian Manhunter? Unfortunately, the answer is almost universally dead. This is the problem with games based on superhero comics. If they're set in a universe where everyone's already established, a part of the player's mind is always asking where any given character who doesn't appear is, especially if the events that transpire have global consequences. Mortal Kombat vs DC Universe sidestepped this issue early on, with some dialogue alluding to some Shaolin Masters from the MK side going missing. No character claims credit for the disappearances, so we're led to assume that it's a byproduct of the two universes merging. Through this, any missing character like Reptile, Goro, Supergirl or Martian Manhunter, who does get name dropped, can be chalked up to the universal merging and the player's mind is put to rest. No such incident occurs in Injustice, so characters being missing just are. The obvious excuse, and I'm really surprised they didn't just go with this, is that those characters are locked up in Superman's gulags and death camps and get freed once he's defeated. However, they instead decided to have them all get killed. There are some exceptions, like a few of the Teen Titans are in the Phantom Zone and John Constantine plays everyone to get out of Dodge, but I can't see them making up the bulk of the new roster. I think one of the most prominent elements of the comic is the characters' personalities. You can tell pretty quickly that the writers from the comics have a much firmer grasp on the characters than the game writers. For instance, Catwoman is much more like the main universe Selina. She cares deeply for Bruce and tries time after time to get him to open up, which he only really does after Dick dies. Selina loves Bruce in the comics and they handled it very well. In the game, she's, well, Yahtzee said it best. But the great irony of the comic is that, at least with some characters like Selina and Barry, the writers trying to portray them more accurately was more of a detriment to the series than anything because it leaves the comic feeling totally at odds with the game and the way it presented the characters. They did try to make the hero's downfall seem more natural, but it didn't really work all that well. There clearly wasn't any sort of grand plan for the comic, it was just a list of groups to remove from the equation in year-long arcs, leaving very little room for properly written descents for the heroes. They did also try to humanise Superman and make his unreasonable descent into Nazism more gradual, but it's still way too sudden. During the events of year 1, he savagely beats Green Arrow to death. Some of you may try to justify it as he's lost his wife and child and he thinks Ollie is trying to harm his parents, the only family he has left, so he snaps. You know what? Fine. It's still totally out of character for Superman, but it could make sense if he hits Ollie once too hard, and it could then be used as a major turning point if Clark is horrified by what he's done and is forever changed by this. But he isn't really, he just carries on as if murdering other heroes is just fine and dandy. He never really shows any remorse for his actions and goes so far as to 1. Burn his friend the Martian Manhunter to death, 2. Heat beam a hole in Black Canary's torso, almost killing her if not for Dr. Fate's intervention, 3. Send Victor Zsasz to murder Alfred Pennyworth just to hurt Bruce, 4. Mortally wound Superboy, his clone and practically son, to force the Titans to take Connor to the Phantom Zone to save his life so they can't oppose him. And that last one is right after he kills the Joker, so he's not far enough down his descent for this to seem like the logical plot progression. There is one specific incident that perfectly exemplifies the problems with both the comics existing as a prequel and the horrendously out of character actions of the cast as a whole. During a big battle in year 3, Wonder Woman battles Batwoman and Huntress. Diana wraps her lasso around Helena's throat and accidentally snaps her neck. Batwoman then beats Diana savagely. Kate later has Diana at her mercy and she decides she's not worth it. You see, this ties into the problem of characters we know are around later in the timeline being untouchable, and also perfectly illustrates how horribly inaccurate the characterization is here. If this Diana was anything like her true comic counterparts, well, for one, she'd never be in this situation to begin with. She might stick with Clark for a while to try and make him see how far he's fallen before realising he's a lost cause and joining Batman to help stop him. But if she ever killed one of her friends or allies, she would be wrought with guilt over it. She'd surrender immediately and most likely work to stop the fighting, then give up the mantle of Wonder Woman after the conflict until she's deemed by herself and her peers to be worthy of bearing the name again. And this affects Kate as well. Now, while Kate has the same moral principles as Batman and doesn't kill, that's not her reason for letting Diana go here. It's hard to look at this moment as Kate choosing, against her deepest wishes, to uphold her moral convictions. Her choice to not kill Diana here is motivated purely by the fact that Diana canonically survives into the game. It would have been better to either not allow Kate to get this close to killing her, or to rewrite the scene to emphasise Kate's morality. But on the subject of horrible murder, some deaths, one could argue, make sense for dramatic effect. I feel like most if not all of them were handled very poorly, but some of them do work, such as Sinestro murdering Jon Stewart. That makes sense. But including Bizarro just to kill him off and having Kate randomly need to sacrifice herself to complete the dimension grabbing process are massive wastes of potential, and do not make the argument that they're not in the game so they had to die. They didn't even need to exist in the comic in the first place. It could just as easily have left them out entirely and let them have their origins later in a sequel. But no, let's just kill them off randomly because that's all the story is about really. Death and misery. And also, Batgirl is in the comic and she gets to live. And don't give me any she's in the game as DLC so she has to live, because Batgirl is only DLC, not in the actual story mode. Where is she? Why doesn't she keep fighting? She doesn't look seriously injured, and even if she was, Bruce would at least mention her in the game's story. Why do other characters have to die to explain their absence if Barbara gets to live despite still being absent? Scarecrow, as mentioned earlier, is killed by the Joker in year 1, then shows up again in year 5. Brian Buccellato, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, the writer from the second half of year 3 onwards, has supposedly confirmed on Twitter that the year 5 appearance is just a production oversight and is actually non-canon, but I couldn't find any proof of that. But either way, this calls into question how Scarecrow is now a playable character in Injustice 2, or at least in the mobile version. Now, you could argue that we don't know for sure that Scarecrow died from Joker's attack, allowing him to survive into year 5 and then the sequel. But as I also mentioned earlier, this Superman would never let Scarecrow live after Metropolis. And another thing I mentioned earlier is that the characters use the wrong costumes in the comics. Looking at the Joker's death in the game, it's clear that the Regime Universe costumes are supposed to be worn the entire time. The only character to use their Regime costume prior to year 5 that I can recall is Hal Jordan, and that's only because of the colour switch. Superman finally changes in year 5, and Damian finally adopts the blue Nightwing suit shortly thereafter. And on a similar note, Catwoman joins Superman maybe a few hours before the game, calling everything she claimed to do for Bruce into question. At the very end of year 5, the Regime characters are all separated via teleportation just as the Prime heroes arrive. There are two main problems with this. The first is that none of the Regime characters bring up the teleportation at all, even though they start appearing in the game maybe a few hours afterwards. On a related note, Superman has just had an encounter with Batman and been exposed for Alfred's murder, but he just completely forgets about it and goes to fuck around with Doomsday. And the other is that they've still not changed to the Regime costumes. From this, it seems that they all randomly decide to change costumes at the same time, that they even have the time to do so before any of them show up on screen, that Batman's costume is worn and weathered not through years of battle, but rather as a stylistic choice like a hipster pair of pre-torn jeans, that Damian, having only recently acquired the Nightwing suit, which he was very honoured to wear, decides to either modify or replace it, and also manages to grow his hair long in a matter of hours. That Cyborg managed to completely overhaul his cybernetics while simultaneously interrogating Deathstroke. That Raven manages to get completely overtaken by Trigon while simultaneously interrogating Deathstroke. Or that Alfred Pennyworth's murder is exposed by Batman as being done on Superman's orders, shocking even super militant Diana, and it's never brought up again. In fact, aside from Bruce and Damian, Dick is the only member of the Bat family to get brought up in the story. Not Tim, not Alfred, not Kate, not Barbara, not Jim, none of them. The comic is supposed to answer all the questions we have, but all it really does is raise more questions and fails to properly gel with the game it leads into. Characters like Plastic Man, Black Lightning, Killer Croc and the Atom are still around, still active, but they don't get involved. Why? What the hell were they doing during these earth-shattering events? And these aren't just nitpicks, don't you dare say that. These are things the comic specifically exists to resolve. They should have just had the comic story end around 6 months prior to the start of the game to allow the myriad differences between the game and the comic to be filled in by a time skip, rather than allowing things to run up so close to the game that none of it makes any sense. And finally, the plan to bring over the alternate universe versions of the characters makes some sense in the game because that's our introduction to the story. It's the entire premise of the story, in fact. But if you start with the comics with no knowledge of the game's plot, this would seem like a total arsepull. The game can get away with not elaborating on the thought process that led to this plan, because that's not really all that important in the grand scheme of things, but in the comic, it's a very important detail because it's the focus of the climax, yet it's not really all that well justified and seems completely random, especially when the eureka moment is when Lex sees the body of Bizarro. He sees a clone of Superman and doesn't think we could clone the members of the Justice League, he thinks we should abduct Justice Leaguers from a parallel universe. Fucking what? Ultimately, the comics have put a huge limit on the future of the setting by slaughtering so many characters. Granted, this was arguably necessary to explain all the absences from the game, but they could just as easily have written around it by saying that these characters aren't all established yet, or that they were imprisoned in the gulags. So you see, there were other options, but someone made the call to be dark and edgy and have everyone die. I wonder if this story might have been better told if there was no game to limit the roster. If the comic was all there was and they could just use all the characters they wanted without having to worry about the cost or roster bloat. If so many characters wouldn't have to die just to explain their absence from the game's limited roster. If there was actual purpose to the story rather than just to make money and fill in the unnecessary backstory to an unnecessarily dark and immature game.